Now that's Ben Ray Lujan, New Mexico Democrat. He was appointed 2 years ago. People said that that's giving too much power to one person, too much power to Nancy Pelosi. So part of this conversation, part of this revolt post-election was we need to spread that power around. So now that role is going to be elected. There was a thought that Ben Ray Lujan would be challenged. Sean Patrick Maloney, he's a New York Democrat, last week had suggested that he might challenge him. Not going to happen, so Lujan will run unchallenged. So, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Lujan will be the D-Trip chair for the next 2 years. But that's going to happen this afternoon. There's also a committee called the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee. This was created a couple years ago, essentially for Steve Israel, New York Democrat, who was ahead of the D-Trip and didn't have a place to go afterwards. So Pelosi carved this position out. That was appointed. Now it's going to be elected, and it's going to be cut into 3 different vice chairmen. So again, spreading power, making it more democratized, allowing these people to vote, whereas Pelosi was appointing in the past. You're going to see a couple of those probably go to Midwest states. So spreading the power around regionally, generationally, and just allowing these people to vote.
Here's a Democrat from Springfield, Virginia. Erica, good morning. You're on.
Hi, good morning. Yes, I want to make a comment about what I think the Democratic Party is not unified, and I think it's because they have walked away from the grassroots. The issues are right. Yes, we all support those issues, but we don't need charity. We don't need $10 minimum wage raise. We want the $15 minimum wage raise. We don't want to lower a student loan debt. We want the student debt to be much more aggressive, so the students can really go back and invest in the economy and not be worried about paying those loans. So we don't need just little things. We need to walk away from corporation influences, and that is very, very important, because as you say, some people want to perpetuate themselves in some positions like Nancy Pelosi, and I respect her very much. But it's time for her to mentor the new generation, to coach the new generation, and have new Democratic leaders come along and embrace the progressive roots, grassroots young generation that really wants to make change away from corporate influence, from the money influence, and that's what we need to fight against. Citizens United.
Erica, we'll let our guests respond. You put a lot out there. Go ahead.
It's a great comment, and part of this discussion that they're having right now is just asking the question, how are we going to defend President Obama's legacy from Donald Trump and congressional majorities in both chambers? And there's a lot of disagreement about what to do on that front. A lot of people agree with you that the reason that the Democrats lost, that their message did not resonate, that they did not get their liberal base out, was because they went too soft on things like that. They didn't fight hard enough for those core liberal values. Liberals stayed at home at the polls, and the rest we know. But there's another side, and I should mention, they have strong champions in Congress, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren in the Senate in particular. Pelosi in the House is in a different spot because she is a leader and she is going to have to negotiate with the other Republican leaders. But in terms of policy, she's, I think, 100% on the same page as Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. So, policy-wise, you have that sector. It's a very liberal-heavy Democratic caucus, and so a lot of people agree exactly with what you said. Shifting gears, there's also recognition that they are going to have to compromise if they're going to get anything done. Mitch McConnell, when Obama was elected, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, who at the time was Minority Leader, but he said his primary goal was not going to be to allow Obama to do anything at all. He wanted him to be a one-term president, and so they just blocked everything. And he was criticized soundly for that. But 8 years later, if you look at the results politically, it seemed to work out very well for the Republicans. So there are some Democrats who are saying we got to make Trump a one-term president. Ruben Gallego said that in no uncertain terms last week. We have to make him a one-term president. So there's kind of a mixed message now. Do we work with Trump? Do we not work with Trump? Do we, the Democrats have always been the party that wants to govern, that believes in government, and so they're kind of at this crossroads where they can't, just burn the house down and just to defeat Trump, just to make Trump look bad and to block everything that he wants to do. There's a sense that they have to work with him, but again, there's also this large group of liberals who feel exactly that you do, that they have to fight for their values and should block anything Trump wants to do that would undo them.
On our independent line from Conestoga, Pennsylvania, for our guest Mike Lillis of The Hill, this is John. John, you're on. Go ahead.
Morning, Pedro. The Pelosi, who's 76 years old, Hoyer, who's 77, and I think the third in charge is 77 or something like that, Clyburn or Elijah Cummings. And they're part of the neoliberal switch that is, can be attached to the Clintons. Clinton in 96 just went neoliberal, which is a corporatist stance. And that hasn't worked. That hasn't worked because it split the Democratic Party between like the Black Caucus and the neoliberals. So they're Republican light. And Bernie was so popular because he wasn't Republican light. He was a Democrat. He was a FDR Democrat, and wasn't taken in by all the money that the neoliberals were. And that's one of the large problems. They need to learn from the Republicans. Republicans have had ALEC in place for 30, 40 years, and they write the laws, and they are really the organization that runs the Republican Party.
I think this goes back to the previous question. As the Democrats try to locate a strategy that's going to get them back on the winning track, do they stick with their liberal values? Do they compromise, which inevitably is going to mean, going back on some of those liberal priorities that they've been pushing? They have. You mentioned Alex, but the Democrats have plenty of support too. Part of their problem, I think, is that they have been for years the party of labor unions, and just with the demise of labor unions over recent years, a lot of their base has eroded. And so the question is appealing to a lot of those workers who were left behind after the Great Recession, convincing them that their Democrats are for them, that their policies are going to help them improve. Particularly economically. I mean, everything is economics these days, right? And that's what this election said. That's what almost all these elections say. 2010 a little bit different because Obamacare played such a factor. But that was the anomaly. Economics is the issue. Democrats have to find a way to appeal to these voters that they say they will help. And until they do that, they're going to be in the minority wilderness.
We have, for Twitter, a viewer who says that he's giddy about Nancy Pelosi's reappointment as it confirms that Dems are tripling down and ensures even greater losses in 2018. Go to 2018, go to 2020. What do Democrats face in the House as far as elections?
Well, the midterm election, of course, is always a tough one for the incumbent party. Pelosi's argument right now is, I've done this before. This was her argument for remaining in power. I've done this before. In 2006, we were in the wilderness. Republicans controlled both chambers. George Bush was in the White House. And we wiped out the Republicans in that midterm election. I've done it before. I can do it again. So that's her argument right now. 2018 is going to be a very difficult cycle for the Republicans. A lot of the vulnerable guys who people thought were going to get wiped out this time are still there, but they're still going to be vulnerable in 2 years. Trump is going to be in office for 2 years. Nobody knows what that's going to look like. But again, historically, it's just a tough cycle for the incumbent party. So Pelosi is saying all those factors combined, we think we can make enormous gains, if not take back the House. So give me one more chance, and we'll see what happens. Senate's different. Senate is tilted very favorably toward the Republicans next time around. So the midterm cycle advantage that the Democrats might otherwise have might not be there to the extent that it will in the House. But Pelosi thinks that she can do it, and we won't know until 2 years from now, but that's her argument.
Sun City, California, Democrats line. Roy, go ahead. Roy from Sun City, good morning, you're on.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're on.
Okay. Thank you for taking my call. Two things. I wish that the Democrats would be obstructionists just like the Republicans were. because they always want to, we as Democrats always want to govern and look out for the people. We need to be ruthless, just like Republicans. And I just want to make one quick statement about your last issue. I wonder how many of the people that want that pipeline would accept it running under Arlington National Cemetery or the Pearl Harbor Memorial in Hawaii.
Okay, thanks, Roy.
I think there are a lot of people who agree with you, a lot of Democrats who agree that they should be ruthless. Again, McConnell was ruthless. He didn't want Obama to get anything done. He filibustered everything, even the things that the Republicans were going to support, just as a delay tactic to keep other things off of the floor. And there are a lot of Democrats who think that Pelosi and incoming Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer should do the same thing. Again, the flip side of that is the Democrats for years have said that they are the party of good government. They believe in government. They believe in governing to help people in their everyday lives. And if they just block everything and we have shutdown threats and all of these different things that we've seen over the past couple years, and the Democrats start being blamed for those things, then suddenly they're not the party of good government. It would be a very sharp political tactic on their part, but they would have to somehow walk that tightrope where they're saying, we're knocking down government in order to save it type of message. And I don't know how successful they would be at sending it to the electorate. But that remains to be seen. And again, that's a discussion that they're having right now, and there are sharp disagreements within the party about how to proceed.
Chris Saleza in the Washington Post this morning takes a look at potential leaders that could have risen up to maybe challenge or replace what's currently in place. Mm-hmm. They highlight Javier Becerra, who's been asked to become the California Attorney General, Chris Van Hollen, who's heading to the Senate, Steve Israel, who's retiring, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who was removed from the chair of the DNC. If that's the case, where do you look to as far as potential leaders? Who's making themselves known right now? Who are the shining stars?
Right. Well, and that has been the problem with the Democratic caucus, right? There's this bottleneck at the top, and so you're having this brain drain of younger guys who hit a certain level, and then there's nowhere else to go. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the figures that have left, and Becerra is just the latest one of those. So it's a problem that they have, and they have to start looking deeper into the bench. They have to start, rooting for these guys to come up, and we don't know who those figures are going to be. But you see Joaquin Castro in Texas is often mentioned as a rising star. He spoke at the convention. Mm-hmm. You got Joe Kennedy in Massachusetts. I think people think he's going to jump back to the state, but if he remains in the House, he's certainly a rising star. And if you look at the nominees that Pelosi just made for some of these new leadership carve-outs, Colleen Hanna-Busa is a Hawaii Democrat who will be now in leadership. They're going to have to elect somebody 5 terms or less. They're going to elect today, so there'll be somebody else at the table. We don't know who that's going to be just yet. Certainly Ruben Gallego, Seth Moulton, and Kathleen Rice, 3 of the insurgents who had made their name this month by opposing Pelosi. They came out very publicly there at the end and endorsed Tim Ryan, which is a political risk for them in the near term, because you don't really want to buck your leader so publicly like that. But they've only been here, they're all sophomores, just elected to their 2nd term, so they're playing the long game, and those are the types of rising stars that you're going to see. A couple other names I'll mention. Sherry Bustos was just nominated to the Policy and Communications Committee as one of the co-chairs. She's a relatively young Illinois Democrat. Hakeem Jeffries, member of the Black Caucus in Queens, also nominated for that vice chairmanship position, and Matt Cartwright from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania just won for the Republicans for the first time in many cycles, so they're trying to get those voters back in the fold. So these are the types of people who want to move up, who may be moving up, and we'll wait and see how successful they are.
This is Mike Lillis, who covers Congress for The Hill. TheHill.com is the website, and we're talking about the role House Democrats will play in the incoming administration, especially after this election. From Pennsylvania Democrats line, Joe, go ahead.
Yes, hello. I've got 3 points here. Number one is the Democrats, no matter what, they have to be taught to get out the vote. It's not a matter of seeing how many people you can register. or how much money Nancy Pelosi can raise. The money's not the main point. The main point is come election day, they have to vote. They're not inspired. Nobody talks about vote. The Republicans are very organized. The Democrats are a mess. It's tragic. Another thing is you need to get rid of the old guard. Nancy Pelosi, these old-timers, they have to go. It's the change of the guard has to come about. And another thing is when the Democrats do get in, they always promise, and a big promise is to the unions. And what do they do for the unions? Nothing. Obama got in, same old stuff. We're going to give back to the unions. They had all three houses. They had all three points of government, and they card check. That's the big thing. You're worried about these people are talking about minimum wage. Card check. If card check was enacted, you wouldn't have to worry about a minimum wage.
Okay, thanks, caller.
You're absolutely right. This goes back to that original point. How do you get voters to the polls? You mentioned that people aren't talking about voters, which I would disagree with. I think everybody is talking about how to energize that vote, more specifically about why this cycle was such a dismal turnout for the Democrats. People are looking back to the past two cycles when you had Obama at the top of the ticket. In 2012 alone, I think there were 69 million Democratic voters who came out for Obama. This time for Hillary Clinton, it was more like 62. So, everybody keeps mentioning it wasn't like this huge groundswell of support for Donald Trump, who didn't get any more voters out than Mitt Romney did. It was Hillary Clinton not energizing the base. So you're perfectly right that the Democrats failed to do so, and they're going to have to improve upon that if they hope to win back these national elections and congressional seats. But to say that they're not talking about it, I don't think is right either. I think that is probably their key focus, and this autopsy that they're going to do is going to examine why the money advantage that they did have here on Capitol Hill and Pelosi raising $150 million and all of these different things didn't exactly work. I will say that if you ask Pelosi and her supporters, they'll say that okay, I think she made I think she brought in $141 million this cycle, which is enormous. I mean, nobody even comes close there on the Hill. And she would say, well, maybe it didn't get us into the majority, but it would have been much worse if we didn't have it. We still need it. Nobody can fill that void. So part of that argument that we're having is over the effectiveness of money, how important is it, and how to make it go further and be more effective.
Well, as far as policy making is concerned, what talk is there now of what the Democratic response will be to efforts to change the Affordable Care Act in the incoming administration and by House Republicans? And on another front, what about this idea of infrastructure spending, which Donald Trump likes to the tune of $1 trillion? What do you think the Democrats are going to be, or what role they play in those two big topics?
Right. Well, two very different topics, obviously. One, the repeal of Obamacare is something that obviously they don't want at all. That is Obama's, domestic achievement, the thing that will be his legacy item if it remains in place. And so the question is, how do we play defense from the minority? Mm-hmm. Republicans are going to vote 100% for repeal. They've done that over and over and over again in the House. So the Senate is the firewall. It's Chuck Schumer. Republicans don't have 60 votes. So Schumer can filibuster anything he wants, and he's going to. He knows very well that he's the last line of defense, and so all eyes are going to be on Chuck Schumer in the Obamacare repeal. I'm sorry. The infrastructure. That debate's going to be fascinating because that's a very different dynamic. This is something that everybody's for infrastructure. Everybody wants to build roads and bridges, bring some money back to the districts. The question is how to pay for it. Trump's made an awful lot of promises. Democrats are vowing to work with them. Republicans are vowing to work with them. But when they get to that issue of how to pay for it, that's when that's when the real questions are going to happen and the real tough decisions are going to have to be made. He's promising $1 trillion, some very vague number, and he doesn't say where or when or how long he wants to spend it. But when they have to come up with $1 trillion, you can't find $1 trillion on Capitol Hill. I mean, these are the budget fights that we have every year. These are the shutdown threats are always over how to fund these different things. So certainly that's an area where they can come together. They can agree. It's rare place where they do agree on a bipartisan basis, but when you talk about how to fund it, it's going to be real messy.
A bit on the modern day there. Congress is about to go out for their break. What needs to be done, especially when it comes to budget issues?
So just two things they've got to wrap up, and the thought is that they could get it done this week. The government does, the spending for the government does expire this Friday on the 9th. So they do have to pass something by then. The question is, will they push it to next week, just a couple days, so that they can get something longer term, or can they pass a continuing resolution, short-term, longer short-term budget bill by the end of the week? And the thought is that maybe they can do it. If the House introduces its bill today, they could vote by Wednesday, send it to the Senate, and everything could be done by Friday. We still haven't seen the bill. So initially there was talk that they would fund the government through March. Now, because Trump will just be coming in and has to appoint his cabinet, Senate has to vote on all these things, all these logistical things that happen at the beginning of a new presidency. The thought now is it might go through May, a little bit longer term. But what this does is it prevents, or it allows the Republicans to have more of a say in the spending fight. They don't have to rely on Barack Obama, who will be gone, of course, in January, and they want to empower Trump to make some of these spending decisions when they can have a Republican in office. The other thing that they have to pass, the House passed a defense authorization bill last week. Senate has to pass that this week. That should probably sail through. There are a couple sticking points there, and Obama hasn't said what he's going to do with it, but defense bills are usually pretty bipartisan, and that's expected to move. The final piece is there's a water resources and development bill, and there's Flint money on that. That's the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. Democrats have been pushing for hundreds of millions of dollars to help that issue. They've been pushing for a year since that crisis started. They finally see their opportunity. Speaker Ryan said that he would do it in December on this water bill, and so that's the other thing that's expected to pass. But a very short calendar, just a couple things, and then they're gone. So we don't really expect any kind of major fights.
Next up for Mike Lillis, Mark, Sanford, Maine, Independent Line.
Yes, hi. Good morning, Pedro. Thanks for C-SPAN. I just listening to the show this morning with the man, his name, the Hill writer, the writer on the Hill. It made me think of what President Johnson quoted back in the 60s. He made a quote that said, "Democrats legislate, Republicans investigate. Because if you can't win on the issues, your only hope is character assassination." I think we have a lot of that going on, more so today than we did back then. And I just think a lot of the callers that had called in and spoke about the Democrats, I think they have been too soft at their game plan, and they need to get tougher. That's my only quote I wanted to call in and say.
It's a great quote, and I'll shoot one back at you. There's another quote, and it says, "Democracy is that thing that ensures that we get no better than we deserve." And I think a lot of Democrats are wondering what's going to happen with this Trump administration and pointing to quotes like that. That's George Bernard Shaw. But one thing I will point out, we've had a stalemate on Capitol Hill for at least the past 6 years since the Republicans came in. There was that Tea Party wave. It was a response to Obamacare and some of the things that President Obama did when he first arrived. And it was also a response to the Democrats having both chambers of Congress and the White House. When one party, historically, when one political party has all the power, there tends to be a pendulum that swings back the other way. That happened in 2010 with the Tea Party wave. House Democrats lost 63 seats, got wiped out, and they have not rebounded yet. But a lot of those Tea Party guys who came in, I mean, they go back to their districts and they're cheered. They're hailed for what they're doing. They were in fact elected to come block Obama's legacy, his legislative agenda, and that's exactly what they did. So for all the criticism that we're hearing on Capitol Hill of shutdowns and stalemates and can't get anything done, and even the spending bills are tough these days, and it's all criticism from inside the Beltway. But when they go back home to their districts, they just hear nothing but praise. So this is democracy at work. I mean, it's messy, and there's a lot of different reasons for it. You could blame the gerrymandering that made, you know, all of these liberal districts extremely liberal and all of these conservative districts extremely conservative. The number of purple districts is minimal at this point, and that's why it's so difficult for the Democrats to get back in power in the House. But for all of these reasons, you know, democracy is messy, and that's what we see here every day on the Hill.
Bodie is in Lakewood, New Jersey. Democrats line. Bodie, go ahead.
Good morning. How are you? Listen, you know, I've been listening for about, since this report from the Hill has been on. He just mentioned gerrymandering. First of all, we're talking politics and conflating it with policy. The cheering that these representatives are getting when they go back to their districts are because they got to select who voted for them through gerrymandering, not the voters selecting who's the best candidate for a given area. I mean, you know, talk about Nancy Pelosi, you talk about the Democratic leadership in the House. When you have gerrymandering and 90% of your district is white, older, whatever, why would you possibly, you know, want to compromise, or why would you possibly want to govern? It's safe, and there's all this false equivalency. Well, the Democrats did it too. Really? If the Democrats, who are in total control of California, their whole government, from the governor on down, if they gerrymandered, what do they have? 55 electoral votes, 53. House seats. If they did that, it would swing back the other way. They did not. Okay?
Thanks, caller.
I think, you know, both parties are guilty of gerrymandering. I mean, there's no question of that. What happened in 2010 was that the Republicans controlled more state houses, and they were very deft in taking advantage of that and carving out a lot more conservative districts than there are liberal districts. But to say that both parties haven't done it, I think, is unfair and inaccurate. We're just living the latest example of it, and because the conservatives were so good at it, that's why it's such an issue right now. But you say the voters don't go out and vote their own members. I think that's inaccurate too. I mean, within those states, they choose the legislators who carved out the map. So it is those voters who are empowered. But first, on the state level, every 10 years after the census, they're going to redraw the map. So if they don't like the map, then voters can go to the state elections and get new people in there who are going to draw a different map. I mean, that's how democracy works on that level. And then, of course, the districts are drawn, and we get the results of that through the House elections. But I don't think that it's fair to say that the Republicans are the only ones who gerrymandered. There's tons of liberal districts, particularly in the urban centers, in the inner cities, and some of those areas that are, you know, perfectly safe, and the same member has been in there for decades as a result.
Mike Lillis, there's a story today about on the Senate side, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, who will get a send-off this week before he leaves Congress. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about the legacy of Harry Reid, what he leaves in Congress, and what's expected this week as far as those who remember him, right, or who will remember his service in the Congress.
Harry Reid he's one of those he's one of those power brokers. He's a very enigmatic guy. You know, he's so soft-spoken, but he's just so he was so good at what he did. And there's numerous stories of him twisting arms to get what he wants. I mean, he's so good behind the scenes. You see him in front of a microphone, and you wonder how is this guy able to do it. But both in his home state of Nevada and on Capitol Hill, I think Obamacare is will be one of his major legacy items, at least in most recent years. But just his ability to unite the party, because there's a lot of moderate, a lot of conservative leading senators there, and he's the one who's got to come into the room and convince them to take a really, really tough vote on something like Obamacare that could hurt their political career, that could end their political career. And he was able to do that both through very good legislative maneuvering, tweaking language so that little carve out for you, little carve out for you. but also just convincing them politically that it was the right thing to do for the party and the country. And a lot of people will miss him, not Republicans, but a lot of Democrats will miss his ability to do those sorts of things.
Do we know what happens now as far as work he'll do, a career he'll pursue?
I don't know the answer to that. He's in his late 70s. I think he would be happy just to go back to Nevada. I don't know the answer to that.
One more call for our guest, and this will be Tom, Conway, South Carolina, our line for Republicans. Tom, you are free to go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm a nonpartisan, and so I don't vote in the primaries, but I'm one of the people that ran away from the Democratic Party, and it's interesting that you mentioned Obama's legacy. He left a legacy because he knows how to tweak. Well, that's the reason why you want to know how to get people back to the Democratic Party. You got to care about the middle class. Working people who work and built this country, pay their taxes, pay into this country, and they're getting clobbered by Obamacare. You had a lieutenant governor, I forget her name, on C-SPAN talk a week or so ago from a northern state, and she presented both sides of it. 20 million get benefits, 200 million get clobbered. You got working class people that can't afford. Outrageous. People tell me they're paying $1,800 a month or $2,100 a month. Middle class people cannot afford that. Plus, they get clobbered on a tax penalty. That's coercion. Obama was told that was unconstitutional, but actually, I think it was a Republican justice that said, "Oh, we'll get around that. We'll make it a tax penalty." That's a money grab. Working class people work hard, and they should be rewarded for saving a few dollars. But what you're doing is depleting their bank accounts. Either they got $1,800. That's a mortgage for some of these people that they couldn't afford to pay. Plus, you're forcing it. The government is putting a gun to their heads. Either you pay it, or we're going to give you bigger. We'll keep increasing the tax penalties.
Caller, we got to leave it there.
Obamacare is his legacy, but it's also one of the most controversial things that I've ever seen passed here on Capitol Hill. It certainly is a partisan issue. It certainly divided the country. It's divided Congress. It's divided an awful lot of people, and it's divided those who either benefit from it or have seen their premiums rise. If you're one of the 20 million people who has insurance now who didn't have it 3 years ago because this law wasn't in place, you might be pretty happy with it. If you're somebody who already had coverage and now you're seeing premiums rise much higher than you expected, then you're not happy with it. So that's just part of the split. It's Congress's job to recognize these deficiencies where they are and fix them. And we'll see what they're going to do with that. The Republicans, of course, want to repeal the whole thing. The question is, what are they going to do with the 20 million people who now have insurance? Do you just drop those people and hope that they don't vote? Or do you come up with a replacement that will get them covered in some way that's affordable and doesn't bust the budget? So this is the debate that we're going to have. The plan the Republicans are going to push, I think, is increasingly clear that they want to repeal it very quickly for political reasons. Trump made this a central issue of his campaign, and Republicans have been trying to do it for years, of course. So they can do it politically, get a very quick win once Trump is in office, but then they can leave the tough decisions for later. They can say, we repealed it, but the repeal isn't going to go into place for 2 years. So that gives us time to find a replacement. They haven't found a replacement over the past 6 years, so we'll see what they do when they have 2 years to do it. But the time crunch is that 2 years is going to move very quickly, and so it'll be interesting to see what they come up with before the 2018 midterms.
Mike Lillis, with all the changes that the House Minority Leader is making as far as the leadership and how it's chosen, right, when do Democrats get a sense if it's working or not? When do they, if this new structure is actually an effective way of going forward? That's
a good question. Well, immediately you'll know if it's working if the insurgents, those who were so unhappy right after the election, if they are satisfied with it, if they feel like they have more voice, if they feel like they have more power to steer this ship, that's the near-term effect, and even that is unclear. I mean, it sounds like they're once Pelosi won, mm-hmm, it sounded like they were, they're okay with it. They at least got their shot to make a protest vote and those sorts of things. Longer term, it's going to be 2018. Did it work? Well, how many people came out to the polls? How many seats did the Democrats pick up? And that'll be the ultimate test.
Mike Lillis, who reports for The Hill. Again, his stories can be found at thehill.com. He covers Congress extensively. And Mike Lillis, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Pedro. Appreciate it.
Coming up, we're going to hear from Ambassador Marc Ginsberg. He'll talk about the advice that he has for the incoming Trump administration on combating homeland terrorist attacks inside of the United States and discussions he's having with social media companies on the topic as well. Later on the program, Liz Farmer will join us for our regular Your Money segment. We'll talk about federal funds that go to city budgets, especially in light of threats by the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, on pulling some of those funds because of harboring illegal immigrants. We'll have those discussions as Washington Journal continues.
Abigail Fillmore was the first lady to work outside the home, teaching in a private school. Mamie Eisenhower's hairstyle and love of pink created fashion sensations. Mamie Pink was marketed as a color, and stores sold clip-on bangs to women eager to replicate her style. Jacqueline Kennedy was responsible for the creation of the White House Historical Association. And Nancy Reagan, as a young actress, saw her name mistakenly on the blacklist of suspected communist sympathizers in the late 1940s. She appealed to Screen Actors Guild head Ronald Reagan for help. She later became his wife. These stories and more are featured in C-SPAN's book, First Ladies, Presidential Historians on the Lives of 45 Iconic American Women. The book makes a great gift for the holidays, giving readers a look into the personal lives of every First Lady in American history, stories of fascinating women, and how their legacies resonate today. Share the stories of America's First Ladies for the holidays. First Ladies, in paperback, published by Public Affairs, is now available at your favorite bookseller and also as an ebook.
We have a special web page at cspan.org to help you follow the Supreme Court. Go to cspan.org and select Supreme Court near the right-hand top of the page. Once on our Supreme Court page, you'll see 4 of the most recent oral arguments heard by the court this term. And click on the View All link to see all the oral arguments covered by C-SPAN. In addition, you can find recent appearances by many of the Supreme Court justices, or watch justices in their own words, including one-on-one interviews in the past few months with Justices Kagan, Thomas, and Ginsburg. There is also a calendar for this term, a list of all current justices with links to quickly see all their appearances on C-SPAN, as well as many other Supreme Court videos available on demand. Follow the Supreme Court at cspan.org.
Washington Journal continues.
Ambassador Marc Ginsberg joining us, the former ambassador to Morocco, also a former Middle East advisor to President Carter, and he's at the public relations firm Levick. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
A recent piece talks about this idea of how to fight ISIS, but not from a sense of them coming to us, but us coming to them, taking the fight to ISIS from the homeland. What inspired this?
I spent a great deal of time in the Middle East trying to deal with the influence of social media and how ISIS uses it to recruit. And back here, as we came back to the United States and started seeing how ISIS is able to use social media, radicalize lone wolves online, I started devoting a great deal of time into this. And in an article that I just wrote in the Huffington Post, I explained that out of the 15 lone wolf attacks from Orlando to San Bernardino to the latest one that we've seen at Ohio State, what has happened, Pedro, is that social media has become, in effect, the oxygen by which ISIS is able to radicalize American lone wolf young men in order to commit terrorist attacks in the United States. What has happened here is that the social media companies, whether it be Twitter, whether it be Facebook, but particularly most egregiously Google and YouTube, they know that there is content online that has been found in the computers of by the FBI of lone wolf terrorists that directly call for the killing of Americans, and yet despite all my pleas, despite everything that I'm writing, Google, YouTube refused to proactively take down the most egregious content that calls for the killing of Americans.
So that's direct conversations you're having with these companies themselves.
I'm particularly having a conversation with YouTube right now, trying to convince them that they have, there is the mechanisms, there's the software that is able to police the website and take down not all the content of Islamic sermons, particularly the sermons of Anwar al-Awlaki, who is the Yemeni cleric who is most culpable in the online radicalization of lone wolves. But if you went online right now, you would see that there are 64,000 hits on YouTube alone for Anwar al-Awlaki, but there are at least 100 of his sermons that directly call for the killing of Americans. It's those that I want Google, YouTube to take down, but they claim that under the Communications Decency Act of 1996, which was passed long before terrorism occurred in the United States, that they're shielded from content liability.
Which means anybody could put something there, and regardless of what the content is, they're not held responsible for it.
Well, there are lawsuits now that have been filed in federal court, particularly by a law firm that goes by the name of 1-800 Law Firm. My colleagues and I have studied the lawsuits, and this is where Levick has provided pro bono support for this. We have gone in and studied what the lawsuits are alleging. The lawsuits are able to, in effect, claim that Google, in particular, is not only aware of this content, but is also making money on it, because people who go online, they're placing ads on the content that is being seen by lone wolves who are committing these attacks.
So if you stop the content via the social media, that doesn't end the problem, though. They'll find content other ways.
Well, let's put it this way. We're trying to make it as hard as possible for people to be radicalized online. Okay? That's the key. You can never completely solve the problem 100%. But why can't we get Silicon Valley to be more proactively willing to take action on content that they themselves acknowledge calls for the killing of Americans? After all, laws have been passed to take down child porn off of social media. There's no unfettered First Amendment rights to yell fire in a crowded movie theater. The Supreme Court has ruled on that. But yet there are people who want to see the internet totally unregulated. Now, come on. Why should we put up with more killing of Americans by lone wolves who are able to, in effect, use the internet, which has been weaponized by ISIS?
Our guest with us to talk about his thoughts on this content on the social media, especially when it comes to inspiring terrorist acts. If you want to ask questions of him, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, and 202-748-8002 for independents. On a small scale, Boston is dealing with something along the lines of what you're advocating, but here's the reaction. This is a story in the Wall Street Journal this morning saying the Boston Police Department taking heat from civil liberty groups for planning to spend $1.4 million on new software that scours social media and the internet for threats. This is also inspired by the attack of the Ohio State University, but there are also concerns about civil rights and especially when it comes to civil liberty groups and what goes on the internet and the freedom to do that. Is that a concern to you as far as the intersection of, enforcing these things, but also keeping civil rights and free speech things in place?
There's always a balance in our country. Let's be real. We live in a society of laws. If you want to be a complete libertarian and say that there's no restriction on free speech, then you're living in the wrong country. Surely there are civil liberties advocates who haven't lost family members, who haven't been injured, who do not see the ramifications of social media content that calls for the killing of Americans and how people are radicalized online by the content that I've seen not only provide recruiting material for people to fight America abroad, but also in the United States. No one is suggesting here that there should be unfettered discretion to take down content. What we're merely suggesting here is there should be at least reasonable efforts by the social media companies. Look, I'll give you a perfect example. I wrote to YouTube. I pointed out to them 5 specific websites where content called for the killing of Americans. 5 days later, they took it down. Is that censorship? They themselves are taking the content down that we're pointing out. The issue to me is not whether or not They are not taking the content down. It's the fact that they're requiring citizens like me to police their website to do so when there's software already available for them to do it themselves.
Does the software then, is it so tailored that it takes down only sites that would be offensive and not anything else?
Absolutely. You can tailor. This software has now been developed. The Counter-Extremism Project, which is run by former Ambassador Marc Wallace in New York, has worked with a professor, a software engineer at Dartmouth, who's developed the software technology. You know, you go, for example, remember how you would watch The Daily Show and they would show only specific clips of specific words? That content software now exists to do that, to police any website and to take down specific content. If you want to put the content software in and it says kill Americans, or anything that says go kill Americans, you can identify it by that software.
As far as the changes to the Communications Decency Act, is that a decision that has to be made by the the incoming, or Congress that has to make that decision itself?
I'm encouraging the Trump administration to seek an amendment to the Communications Decency Act that would, in effect, require Silicon Valley content providers that are shielded from content liability to just use their best efforts to take down the content that is most egregious and that calls for the killing of Americans.
Have you had a chance to talk with the administration itself on these?
Not yet. Not yet, but I'm hoping that I'll have a chance to do so because, look, whether you're Democrat or Republican, the idea that we somehow or other can't do better to police the content, to prevent online radicalization, and to avoid having more lone wolf attacks in the United States is beyond my comprehension. This is something that is that any Democrat or Republican or Independent should want to see happen.
Again, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats and Independents, 202-748-8002. Our guest, again, was the former ambassador to Morocco, also the former Mideast advisor to President Carter, and currently is the managing director for U.S. and international business at Levick. When it comes to this idea of fighting ISIS overall, aside from the social media aspect, what do you think has been the record of the current administration on this effort?
I must say that the administration arrived far too late to the story, so to speak. The administration had originally claimed that ISIS was a JV squad, and frankly, if they had not engaged in the most egregious attacks in Iraq against the Yazidis and other Christian minorities, I doubt that we would have seen any ramp up of efforts by the Obama administration. But you know, for all the months and years that I've spent in the Middle East, the one thing that I've come to understand, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS, the threat of Sunni radical Islam is a dangerous threat to the United States. And the one thing that I came to understand is that even as the administration began slowly ramping up militarily, the soft power effort to fight ISIS online has been really a disaster. The State Department has failed. It's recently set up something called the Global Engagement Center under Richard Engel, but even under that leadership, it has not been able to effectively thwart either lone wolf attacks in the United States or to develop the right messaging abroad to try to stop the enlistment of young Arabs to join ISIS. And frankly, it's not only our job. What we have also failed to do here is to adequately engage Arab states in this effort as well. I mean, it's not, the one thing that everyone keeps waiting for is the United States to solve every problem in the Middle East. It's really not our problem to solve. In the end, this is a fight between Sunni and Shiite, the branches of Islam and the rightful heir to the Prophet Muhammad. We're never going to designate and resolve that problem.
The question comes in light of the Defense Secretary Ash Carter saying now that the U.S. military has to maintain a presence in the Middle East even after this administration leaves, specifically with concerns about ISIS.
Well, indeed, and let's just talk about the battle for Mosul. What happens? Who's going to govern Mosul? Who's going to govern Raqqa in Syria after we defeat or this coalition defeats ISIS? I don't want to believe that we have to engage once again in nation building, but there's got to be a way of solving the vacuum that is going to be created as a result. There's enough challenge that we face between Shiite militia forces that are battling inside Sunni liberated areas that are going to cause problems in and of themselves. And secondly, the vacuum of ISIS being defeated militarily doesn't solve the fact that ISIS is still a presence ideologically in the region. And in effect, we have to have a much more multi-pronged approach to defeating ISIS, as well as defending the homeland more securely. I said my op-ed is in the Huffington Post is not merely just about ISIS, but also many of the steps that we can take better to protect the homeland.
First call for you comes from Christina. She's in Valley City, Ohio, Republican line. Christina, you're on. Go ahead.
Yes. There's a reason that we don't have restrictions on speech, and that's because even though these people are doing heinous things, like any law enforcement, this is open to the public. We can listen to these heinous things, find out what they're doing to defend ourselves. We can't defend ourselves if these people, even if it's a small percentage, if it gets suppressed, we become ignorant of what they're doing and what they're up to. We need to know these things because we need to know how to defend ourselves. All these law enforcement agencies, all the people that we call for help, they get trained in this. They listen to these things. They see these horrible things that are happening to people. We need the free speech without restrictions so that we know how to defend ourselves. The family is the first line of defense, always. And when they're saying these things, we need to know how to do what they're doing, because if we see somebody with a backpack, we need to be suspicious. Could that be something that's no good? We're not going to know this if it's blotted out from our vocabulary. And
well, I appreciate the comment, and you make a very good points. Let me just explain. What we're talking about here and what I'm encouraging is for us to act a little bit more responsibly about how to, in effect, remove content that is radicalized young Muslims in the United States to commit terrorist attacks against Americans. At the same time, there is unencrypted websites that continue to operate that that the FBI is able to continue to monitor and without any restrictions on content. But what we're trying to do here is to come up with a reasonable approach that protects Americans from the online radicalization sermons of, for example, Anwar al-Awlaki, who's already dead. He's dead, but his content continues to reach from the grave to radicalize Americans online. Taking that content down, even if it took all 64,000 websites down from YouTube, are not going to make it harder for the police to understand exactly what's going on online.
From Alexandria, Virginia, Democrats line. Mike, good morning.
Good morning. I'm wondering if your guest could comment on something I've heard, that the Googles and the YouTubes of the world are resistant to doing any of this work because if they're responsible for monitoring content from ISIS, they'd be responsible for monitoring content from folks who may be violating copyright, and that they would therefore be financially liable in that regard.
Excellent point. And yet at the same time, in the conversations I've had with Google's senior management, when the issue here is not so much that they're not policing, they already have, in effect, important statements of content control that they themselves already act upon. So they themselves are acting as censors, whether or not someone like me is pointing out malicious content that is in effect calling for the killing of Americans. And so in this instance, where in effect I've pointed out content to them that is already falls within the violations of their own statement of policy and they're taking the content down, well, that suggests to anyone that they themselves recognize that it violates their own statement of policy, and therefore they themselves are acting as the censor on the very content that someone like me is bringing to their attention, and yet they themselves know exists on their own platform.
Independent line, Springfield, Virginia. John is next.
Hi, good morning. How are you?
Good morning.
I think what we're dealing with is an oversimplification, and it's just not going to work. And if you'll allow me an example, let's say I were to take this exact conversation and put it on YouTube. Let's put copyright issues aside, but according to what your guest wants to do, this would be banned because some sort of computer program said, oh, well, he said kill Americans, and it picked up kill Americans, and so therefore it needs to be banned. So you have some easy calls on the end of actual ISIS videos, and you have some wrong calls as far as something like this, which is pure free speech. What do you do with the strange ones in the middle? Someone saying some crazy conspiracy theory. Someone's going to have to make that call, and I don't think that by restricting it, you're going to be able to have the ability to control it. Child pornography is a different thing. You know it's wrong when you see it. This is free speech. There's going to be a line drawn, and someone's going to be upset where you draw the line.
Listen, there's no doubt, and the Supreme Court has put time and again restrictions on free speech, and we don't live in a society where there's unfettered free speech. And I'm not suggesting that anyone act as a censor, but all of the content providers, whether it be Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, already act as censors on content that they consider violating their own statements of policy. And I'm not merely suggesting that there's going to be a citizens police squad that is policing this content. I'm already serving as a citizen that is merely bringing this content to their attention. And if I bring content to their attention that they consider to be falls within this gray area, they're not going to take it down. But I'll only point out to you that in the instances where I brought the content to their attention that calls for the killing of Americans, they took it down. So they themselves are doing precisely what you said they shouldn't be doing.
Laura lives in Spokane, Republican line.
Hi, I would like to know, I feel very unsure about the reports from the media that they're more politically driven than they are to be directly honest with our country, with the American people regarding this issue. And I'm wondering, what do you feel? I would just like to know, how do you feel the media can be improved to give us the honest truth and not soft soap all of this that's going on?
Well, in my instance, in the instance of trying to, in effect, protect the homeland and protect the lives of Americans from the harm of radical Islam, my issue here goes far more comprehensively than the issue that I'm dealing with, that is the role of content providers. The problem of radicalization by lone wolves that resulted in the attacks over the last 15 years in the United States is what I'm most concerned about. How can we do more? And what can the media do, I think, is the most important concern, is educate Americans better on the Middle East, on the role of Islam, the proper role of Islam in training young Arabs in understanding that Islam should not be used as an effect, as a explanation or justification to engage in jihad and to murder innocent Arabs, innocent Muslims, or innocent Americans, or what have you. Look, I spent all my formative years growing up in the Middle East. I was the first Jewish ambassador to an Arab country from the United States. I understand the Arab world extraordinarily well. There are millions of Arabs who've been victimized by ISIS and by online radical Islam as much as Americans. And so this is a challenge that we face not only in the United States, but also throughout the Middle East. They need better tools and they need better leaders who are willing to take on the threat of radical Islam online, because after all, the message of radical Islam used by ISIS attracted almost 20,000 recruits from around the Arab world to travel to Iraq and to Syria to fight for ISIS on behalf of an Islamic State that was the most egregious, barbaric example that Islam could possibly offer since the days of Osama bin Laden.
A viewer asked off of Twitter saying, why would you contact YouTube, Google, etc., not the FBI, the NSA, or Homeland Security?
I've contacted all of them. I wrote a letter to the head of YouTube and copied not only members of Congress, but the FBI, the NSA, and all of the others, in effect asking for this debate and having this debate about what should be the proper role of content providers in helping to defend Americans and to act more responsibly as good corporate citizens of the United States.
Let's hear from Diane in Minnesota. Republican line, you're on with our guest, Ambassador Marc Ginsberg.
Good morning, Pedro. Mark,
yes.
Number one, I noticed that you're from the Carter administration, which was, we all know how that went down. But anyway, I don't think you're telling the truth. It's probably why we don't believe you anymore, any of you. And if you just look back and look at everything and watch and study, which everyone who watches C-SPAN, we do that. We do not get the correct information. You did not give us the correct information. You did not tell the truth most of the time on the TV. So
caller, in this case, can you give an example? Be specific.
All right. Most of what's been happening over in the foreign countries, when they actually it started way back with the first Bushes. You mentioned a little word, or a few little words at the beginning of a conversation. That was nation building. We all know what nation building means.
I'm not sure that I understand. I'm not sure what point you're trying to make about whether or not I'm telling the truth. What exactly are you saying that I'm not telling the truth on, so I can help explain myself?
And you have, let's number one, not bring any more like our almost president or our future president has said he's going to do, Trump. He said he's going to stop most of the immigrants from foreign countries. Let's do it right this time, okay?
Well, what does that have to do with telling the truth?
She's gone.
Okay.
Sheila, Washington, D.C., Republican line, you're next. Sheila from Washington, D.C.?
Oh, yes, thank you. My question to your guest is that I've heard him speak about radical Islamic websites, but most of the things that we've seen in this country appears to be homegrown.